Mary Poppins Opens the Door by P.L. Travers. Chapter 2, Mr. Twigleys Wishes. "Oh, do come on, Mary Poppins," said Michael impatiently as he danced up and down on the pavement. Mary Poppins took no notice. She was standing in the lane, admiring her reflection in the brass plate on Dr. Simpson's gate. "You look quite tidy," Jane assured her. "Tidy," Mary Poppins snorted. Tidy in her new black hat with the blue bow. Tidy indeed. Handsome, she thought, would be nearer the mark. Tossing her head, she strode on quickly, and they had to run to keep up with her. The three of them were walking through the fine May afternoon to find Mr. Twigley, for the drawing-room piano was out of tune, and Mrs. Banks had asked Mary Poppins to find a piano tuner. "There's my cousin, ma'am, Mr. Twigley. Just 3 blocks from here," Mary Poppins had announced. And when Mrs. Banks said she had never heard of him, Mary Poppins, with her usual sniff, had reminded Mrs. Banks that her relatives were composed of the very best people. And now Jane and Michael, who had already met 2 members of Mary Poppins' family, were wondering what Mr. Twigley would be like. "I think he will be tall and thin like Mr. Turvey," said Michael. "I think he will be round and fat like Mr. Wigg," said Jane. "I never knew such a pair for thinking," said Mary Poppins. "You'll wear your brains out. Turn here, please." They hurried along and turned a corner and found themselves standing in a narrow street lined with small old-fashioned houses. "Why, what street is this? I never saw it before, and I've been here lots of times," cried Jane. "Well, don't blame me," Mary Poppins snapped. "You don't suppose I put it there?" "I shouldn't wonder if you did," said Michael as he gazed at the strange little houses. Then he added with a flattering smile, "You're so very clever, you know." "Humph," she said tartly, though her mouth took on a conceited look. "Clever is as clever does, and it's more than you are anyway." And sniffing, she led them down the street and rang the bell of one of the houses. "Pang!" said the bell loudly, and at the same moment an upstairs window swung open. A large head with a knob of hair at the back bobbed out like a jack-in-the-box. "Well, what's the matter now?" a harsh voice cried. Then the woman looked down and spied Mary Poppins. "Oh, it's you, is it?" she said angrily. "Well, you just turn around and go back to wherever you came from. He isn't in." The window swung to, and the head disappeared. The children felt very disappointed. "Perhaps we can come again tomorrow?" said Jane anxiously. "Today or never, that's my motto," snapped Mary Poppins, and she rang the bell again. This time it was the front door that burst open. The owner of the head stood before them, glowering. She wore large black boots, a blue and white checked apron, and a black shawl round her shoulders. Jane and Michael thought she was the ugliest person they had ever seen, and they felt very sorry for Mr. Twigley. "What, you again?" the huge woman shouted. "I told you he wasn't in. And in he is not, or my name's not Sarah Clump." "Then you aren't Mrs. Twigley," exclaimed Michael with relief. "Not yet," she remarked, with an ominous smile. "Here, down you come, all of you," she added, for Mary Poppins, with the speed of a serpent, had slipped through the doorway and was dragging the children up the stairs. "Do you hear me? I'll have the law on you, bursting into a decent woman's house like a set of vampires." "Decent?" said Mary Poppins, snorting. "If you're decent, I'm a dromedary." And she rapped 3 times on the door at her right. "Who's there?" called an anxious voice from within. Jane and Michael trembled with excitement. Perhaps Mr. Twigley was at home after all. "It's me, Cousin Fred. Unlock the door, please." There was a moment's silence, then the sound of a key being turned in the lock. The door opened, and Mary Poppins, pulling the children after her, shut it and locked it again. "Let me in, you pirate!" roared Mrs. Clump, angrily rattling the handle. Mary Poppins laughed quietly. The children glanced about them. They were in a large attic littered with scraps of wood, tins of paint, and bottles of glue. Every available space in the room was filled with musical instruments. A harp stood in one corner, and in another was a pile of drums. Trumpets and violins hung from the rafters. Flutes and tin whistles were stacked on the shelves. A dusty table by the window was littered with carpenter's tools, and on the edge of the bench was a small polished box with a tiny screwdriver tossed beside it. In the middle of the floor stood 5 half-finished musical boxes, Brightly they shone in their fresh new colors, and round them, chalked on the boards in large white letters, were the words, "Wet Paint." The whole attic smelt deliciously of wood shavings, paint, and glue. There was only one thing missing from it, and that was Mr. Twigley. "Will you let me come in, or shall I go for the police?" shouted Mrs. Clump, banging again. Mary Poppins took no notice, and presently they heard her thumping downstairs, muttering furiously as she went. "Has she gone?" A thin voice cackled anxiously. "She's gone downstairs, and I've locked the door. Now what have you done with yourself, please, Fred?" Mary Poppins gave an impatient sniff. "I've wished, Mary," chirped the voice again. Jane and Michael stared round the dusty attic. Where could Mr. Twigley be? "Oh, Fred, don't tell me it's the... Well, wish again, please, wherever you are. I haven't all day to waste." "All right, I'm coming. No need for excitement." The violins played a stave of music. Then, out of the air, as it seemed to the children, came two short legs clad in baggy trousers. They were followed by a body in an old frock coat. And, last of all, came a long white beard, a wrinkled face with glasses on its nose, and a bald head in a smoking cap. "Really, Cousin Fred," said Mary Poppins crossly, "you're old enough to know better." "Nonsense, Mary," said Mr. Twigley, beaming. "Nobody's ever old enough to know better. I'm sure you agree with me, young man." He looked at Michael with his twinkly eyes, and Michael couldn't help twinkling back. "But where were you hiding?" he demanded. "You couldn't have just come out of the air." "Oh, yes, I could," said Mr. Twigley. "If I wished," he added, and he skipped round the room. "You mean you just wished and you disappeared?" With a glance at the door, Mr. Twigley nodded. "I had to get away from her." "Why? What would she do to you?" asked Jane. "Why, because she wants to marry me. She wants to get my wishes." "Do you get everything you wish for?" asked Michael enviously. "Oh, everything. That is, if I wish on the first new moon, after the second wet Sunday, after the 3rd of May, and she," Mr. Twigley waved at the door, "she wants me to wish for a golden palace and a peacock pie every day for dinner. What would I do with the golden palace? All that I want is—" "Be careful, Fred," warned Mary Poppins. Mr. Twigley clamped his hands to his mouth. "Tut, tut, I really must remember. I used up 2 wishes already." "How many do you get?" asked Jane. 7, said Mr. Twigley, sighing. "Oh, my godmother thought that a suitable number. I know the old lady meant it kindly, but I'd rather have a silver mug, more useful and much less trouble." "I'd rather have wishes," said Michael stoutly. "Oh, no, you wouldn't," cried Mr. Twigley. "They're tricky and hard to handle. You think out the loveliest things and ask for them. Supper time comes when you're feeling hungry and you find yourself wishing for sausage and mash." "What about the 2 you've already had? Were they any good?" demanded Michael. "Well, not so bad, now I come to think of it. I was working on my birdie there," Mr. Twigley nodded toward his bench, "when I heard her coming up the stairs. Oh, goodness, I thought, I wish I could vanish. And when I looked round, I wasn't there. It gave me quite a turn for a moment. No wonder she told you I was out." Mr. Twigley gave a happy cackle as he beamed at the children and swung his coat-tails. They had never seen such a twinkly person. He seemed to them more like a star than a man. "Then, of course," Mr. Twigley went on blandly, "I had to wish myself back again in order to see Mary Poppins. Now, Mary, what can I do for you?" "Mrs. Banks would like a piano tune, please, Fred. Number 17, Cherry Tree Lane, opposite the park," Mary Poppins said primly. "Ah, Mrs. Banks, then these must be—" Mr. Twigley waved his hand at the children. "They're Jane and Michael Banks," she explained, glancing at them with a look of disgust. "Delighted. I call this a very great honor." Mr. Twigley bowed and flung out his hands. "I wish I could offer you something to eat, but I'm all at 6s and 7s today." A flute rang gaily through the attic. "What's this?" Mr. Twigley staggered back, and each of his upturned outstretched hands lay a dish of peaches and cream. Mr. Twigley stared. Then he sniffed at the peaches. "There goes my 3rd wish," he said ruefully as he handed the dishes to the children. "Well, it can't be helped. I've still got 4 more, and now I shall have to be really careful." If you must waste wishes, Cousin Fred, I wish you would waste them on bread and butter. You'll spoil their supper, snapped Mary Poppins. Jane and Michael spooned up their peaches hungrily. They were not going to give Mr. Twigley the chance of wishing them away again. And now, said Mary Poppins, as the last mouthful disappeared, say thank you to Mr. Twigley, and we'll get along home. Oh, no, Mary. Why, you've only just come. Mr. Twigley was so shocked that for once he stood quite still. Oh, do stay a little longer, Mary Poppins, Jane and Michael begged. The thought of leaving Mr. Twigley all alone with his wishes was too much for them. Mr. Twigley took Mary Poppins's hand. I feel so much safer when you're here, Mary, and it's ages since we've seen each other. Why not stay for a while? I wish you would. Jug, 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 jug. A shower of bird notes broke on the air. At the same moment, the determined look on Mary Poppins' face changed to a polite smile. She took off her hat and laid it on the bench beside the glue pot. Oh, my! Mr. Twigley gasped in horror. I've been and gone and done it again. That's 4! cried Jane and Michael gaily, shouting with laughter at his look of surprise. 4, 4, 4, 4. The bird notes echoed. Dear me, how careless! I'm ashamed of myself. For a moment, Mr. Twigley looked almost sad. Then his face and his feet began to twinkle. Well, it's no good crying over spilt wishes. We must just take care of the ones that are left. I'm coming, my duckling. I'm coming, my chick, he called in the direction of the bird notes. And, tripping to the dusty table, he took up the little polished box. His fingers touched a hidden spring. The lid flew open, and the smallest, brightest bird the children had ever seen leapt up from the nest of gold. Clear jets of music poured from its beak. Its small throat throbbed with the stream of notes. Jug, 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 teru, it sang, and when the burning song was ended, the bird dropped back in its golden nest. Oh, Mr. Twigley, what bird is that? Jane looked at the box with shining eyes. A nightingale, Mr. Twigley told her. I was working on him when you came in. He has to be finished tonight, you see. Such lovely weather for nightingales. Why don't you just wish? Suggested Michael. Then you needn't do any work. What? Wish on my birdie? Certainly not. You see what happens when I start wishing? Why, he might turn into a bald-headed eagle. Will you keep him to sing for you always? Jane asked enviously. She wished she could have a bird like that. Keep him? Oh, dear, no. I'll set him free. Can't litter the place up with finished work. I've more things to do than take care of a bird. I have to put figures on these. I have to put figures on those, he nodded at the half-finished musical boxes. And I've got a rush order that must be finished. A music box playing A Day in the Park. A day in the park? The children stared. The band, you know, Mr. Twigley explained. And the sound of the fountains, and gossiping ladies, rooks caw-cawing, and children laughing, and the slow, soft murmur of trees as they grow. Mr. Twigley's eyes glowed behind his spectacles as he thought of all the lovely things he would put in the musical box. But you can't hear trees growing, protested Michael. There's no music for that. Tut, said Mr. Twigley impatiently. Of course there is. There's a music for everything. Didn't you ever hear the earth spinning? It makes a sound like a humming top. Buckingham Palace plays Rue Britannia. The River Thames is a drowsy flute. Dear me, yes, everything in the world. Trees, rocks and stars and human beings. They all have their own true music. As he spoke, Mr. Twigley tripped across the floor and wound up a musical box. Immediately the little platform at the top began to turn, and from within came a clear, high piping like the sound of a penny whistle. That's mine, said Mr. Twigley proudly, as he cocked his head to listen. He wound up another musical box, and a new tune fell on the air. That's London Bridge is Falling Down. It's my favourite song, cried Michael. What did I tell you? Smiled Mr. Twigley as he turned another handle. The tune broke gaily from the box. That's mine, said Jane with a crow of delight. It's Oranges and Lemons. And we'll pause there.